Somewhere in the grasslands of the ancient Near East, roughly 10,000 years ago, a wild animal called the aurochs was tamed by people who had no idea what they were setting in motion. The aurochs was enormous, aggressive, and dangerous, standing taller at the shoulder than most modern cattle, and capable of killing a man with a single charge. But small, isolated populations of these animals were bred into something calmer, smaller, and more manageable. And from that domestication event, cattle spread outward across Europe, Africa, and Asia, along with the farming societies that depended on them. From the very beginning, cattle were never just meat. They were plows pulling fields into productivity. They were milk, leather, horn, and bone. They were wealth that could walk, breed, and be counted, which is precisely why so many ancient economies measured value in heads of cattle rather than coins. In parts of East Africa, cattle became so central to social life that a family's herd size determined marriage arrangements, political standing, and inheritance. In India, cattle took on religious significance that persists today. In the Roman world, the word for money, pecunia, derived directly from pecus, the Latin word for cattle. Long before beef was a product sold in a store, it was a living form of currency, status, and survival. But raising cattle has always required one resource above all others: land. A cow needs grass, and grass needs open space. As cattle-keeping societies grew, they didn't simply live alongside the landscape, they reshaped it. Forests were cleared for pasture in ancient Britain and Gaul, long before Rome ever arrived. Wooded hillsides in the Mediterranean were stripped bare by goat and cattle grazing, centuries before industrialization existed as a concept. The relationship between cattle and deforestation is not a modern invention. It is baked into the very act of pastoralism, because an animal that eats grass all day needs somewhere to do it, and that somewhere has to come from somewhere else. Still, for most of human history, cattle-driven deforestation was local and slow, matched to the pace of population growth and the limits of pre-industrial farming. That would change entirely once cattle left the Old World. In 1493, on his second voyage to the Americas, Christopher Columbus brought cattle across the Atlantic for the first time, unloading them on the island of Hispaniola. It was a small, almost incidental cargo compared to the gold, sugar, and human suffering that would come to define Spanish colonization, but it planted the seed of a transformation that would eventually reach every corner of two continents. Cattle bred well in the Caribbean's warm climate, and Spanish colonizers quickly realized that letting herds roam semi-wild across open land was far easier than the intensive management required back home. Within a few decades, feral cattle populations exploded across island landscapes that had never known a hoofed grazing animal of this kind, and Spanish colonial administrators began exporting the same model to the mainland, Mexico, Central America, and eventually the vast grasslands of what would become the American Southwest. This wasn't simply animal husbandry. It was a system of land claiming disguised as agriculture. Spanish missions in California and Texas used cattle herds not just to feed settlements, but to physically occupy contested territory. A herd grazing across a valley was a visible, undeniable assertion that Spain, and later Mexico, intended to hold that land permanently. The vaqueros who managed these herds, skilled horsemen using braided rawhide ropes and deep knowledge of open-range cattle handling, developed almost all of the working techniques that would later be repackaged and sold to the world as the American cowboy myth. Long before an English-speaking rancher ever roped a steer in Texas, Mexican vaqueros had already built the entire working culture of cattle ranching from the ground up. Meanwhile, the land those cattle occupied was never empty. Across the plains, deserts, and forests of the Americas, indigenous nations had built entire civilizations around the ecosystems that existed before cattle arrived. In North America, bison sustained the economies, diets, ceremonies, and mobility of plains nations for thousands of years, without requiring the kind of permanent, fenced, exclusive land claims that cattle ranching depended on. In Mesoamerica and South America, dense forests supported agricultural systems, hunting economies, and settlements that had thrived for centuries. Cattle ranching didn't simply introduce a new animal into these landscapes. It introduced an entirely different logic of land use, one built around exclusive ownership, branding, and permanent conversion of natural landscape into pasture. Grass that had once supported wild herds and human communities living in balance with it was now being converted into someone's private property, marked by fire-branded hides and defended, eventually, by fences and firearms. By the 18th century, cattle ranching had become one of the primary economic engines of Spanish and Portuguese colonial America. In Brazil, Portuguese colonizers pushed cattle ranching deep into the interior, specifically because the animals required so little labor compared to sugar plantations, allowing colonizers to claim vast stretches of territory with a fraction of the workforce needed for other cash crops. Ranches spread along river corridors and into scrubland regions like the Brazilian Sertão, clearing brush and forest as they went, always chasing the same basic economic logic that had driven Spanish missions centuries earlier. Cattle turned open land into wealth, and wealth justified further expansion. This is the piece of the story that rarely makes it into popular retellings of how beef became a global food. We tend to picture the modern steak or hamburger as a triumph of agricultural efficiency, a clean industrial product divorced from history. But its origins are inseparable from colonization itself. Cattle were among the very first tools of territorial conquest in the Americas, arriving alongside horses, disease, and firearms, and reshaping ecosystems long before a single railroad or refrigerated railcar existed. The forests and grasslands that fell to make room for early colonial herds were not empty frontiers waiting to be developed. They were homelands, hunting grounds, and farmland belonging to people who had no say in the matter. What makes this story different from most accounts of agricultural history is the sheer durability of the pattern it established. The logic that drove Spanish and Portuguese colonizers to clear land for cattle 4 centuries ago is, in its basic shape, the same logic that drives industrial-scale cattle ranching into rainforests today. Land is cheap or free until it is claimed. Grass makes an animal that can walk itself to market. And once an economy organizes itself around that simple fact, the pressure to convert more land into pasture rarely reverses on its own. It simply moves to wherever forest still stands. By the time cattle reached the open grasslands of North America in large commercial numbers, the pattern was already centuries old. Colonization, land conversion, and cattle economies moving together as a single force. What happened next, as railroads, refrigeration, and industrial slaughterhouses entered the picture, would take that same colonial logic and turn it into a machine capable of feeding and reshaping an entire planet. By the middle of the 19th century, cattle ranching in the Americas had spent 300 years perfecting a single skill, turning open land into livestock. What it hadn't yet mastered was turning that livestock into a nationwide industry. That transformation required something cattle alone couldn't provide. It required iron rails, refrigerated cars, and a city willing to become the center of it all. After the American Civil War, Texas found itself with millions of cattle and almost no local market able to absorb them. A steer roaming the brush country of South Texas might be worth only a few dollars. The same animal, delivered to a rail line and shipped toward the growing cities of the East, could be worth many times more. That price gap, and little else, was enough to set herds moving north by the hundreds of thousands, along trails like the Chisholm, driven by cowboys whose working culture had been borrowed almost entirely from the Mexican vaqueros who came before them. Cattle towns rose along the rail lines to receive them. Abilene, Dodge City, Ellsworth, each one a temporary boomtown built entirely around the seasonal arrival of herds and the buyers waiting to ship them east. But herding animals to a railhead only solved half the problem. Live cattle shipped by rail lost weight, arrived injured or dead, and still had to be slaughtered somewhere near the point of sale, which meant local butchers retained enormous control over the final product. The real transformation came when a Chicago meatpacker named Gustavus Swift asked a deceptively simple question. Why ship the whole animal at all, when you could slaughter it near the source and ship only the meat? The idea faced resistance from nearly every direction. Railroads had already built their business models around shipping live animals and had little interest in a system that required specialized refrigerated cars. Local butchers, whose livelihoods depended on slaughtering nearby, saw dressed beef shipped from a distant city as an existential threat. Early refrigeration technology was unreliable, prone to spoiling meat if the ice melted too quickly, or freezing it if the airflow wasn't managed correctly. Swift pushed forward anyway, and by the final decades of the 19th century, refrigerated rail cars had become reliable enough to make the system work. Chicago's packers, Swift among them, could now slaughter, chill, and ship dressed beef across the entire country while keeping the hides, bones, fat, and offal in Chicago to be turned into leather, soap, fertilizer, and glue. This single shift changed where power in the beef industry actually lived. Control moved away from ranchers and local butchers and concentrated instead in the hands of the packing companies that owned slaughter, refrigeration, and distribution all at once. Chicago's Union stockyards became the literal center of that power, a sprawling industrial complex where cattle arrived as living herds and left as standardized cuts, byproducts, and canned goods. Inside, workers performed narrow, repeated tasks on a moving disassembly line long before Henry Ford ever applied the same logic to automobiles. The animal came apart in stages, each worker responsible for one motion, repeated thousands of times a day. The people doing that work were overwhelmingly immigrants and migrants. Germans, Irish, Poles, Lithuanians, and Black Americans who had moved north seeking better wages than what the post-war South offered. The conditions were dangerous and exhausting, and in 1906, a novelist named Upton Sinclair exposed them to the public in a book called The Jungle. Sinclair had intended to draw attention to the suffering of immigrant labor, but readers fixated instead on the filth of the meat itself, the possibility that spoiled or contaminated product was reaching their tables. The public outcry helped push federal regulation into existence that same year, forcing a level of oversight onto an industry that had grown too large, too fast, and too far removed from the consumers who depended on it. By the 20th century, beef had become thoroughly industrial in the United States, and its next transformation came not from the slaughterhouse, but from the drive-through window. Hamburger, once viewed with suspicion because grinding meat could conceal spoilage or low-quality scraps, was rebranded through visible cleanliness. Chains like White Castle built their early reputation on open kitchens and standardized procedure, convincing customers that ground beef could be safe and respectable. After the 1950s, chains multiplied that model into a national, then global template. A standardized patty, a standard bun, a standard grill time, replicated identically from one town to the next. Fast food didn't just sell hamburgers, it sold predictability. And predictability required an entirely different kind of cattle system, one built around feedlots rather than open range, where animals could be finished quickly on concentrated grain rations to produce the consistent size, fat content, and cost that a franchise model demanded. As American demand for cheap, uniform beef grew, so did the search for cheaper land and cheaper cattle elsewhere. And that search increasingly pointed south, towards Central and South America, where colonial-era cattle ranching had already laid centuries of groundwork. In the decades after World War II, as American fast food chains expanded and supermarket beef consumption climbed, a new trade pattern emerged that researchers would later call the hamburger connection. Central American countries like Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala began converting forest and farmland into cattle pasture at an accelerating pace, driven in large part by demand for cheap beef exports to the United States. This wasn't simply market forces operating in a vacuum. Governments in the region actively encouraged the conversion, offering land grants, tax incentives, and low-interest loans to anyone willing to clear forest and stock it with cattle, viewing beef exports as a fast route to foreign currency and economic development. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, enormous stretches of Central American tropical forest disappeared under this pressure, cleared not primarily for local food needs, but to supply a beef market thousands of miles away. Brazil followed a related but distinct path. Portuguese colonial ranching had already pushed cattle deep into the country's interior centuries earlier, favoring livestock precisely because it required so little labor compared to sugar and required no permanent settlement to generate wealth. In the 20th century, Brazilian government policy accelerated that same logic on an industrial scale, offering land titles and infrastructure investment to anyone willing to occupy and develop the interior, particularly the Amazon basin. Cattle ranching became one of the most straightforward ways to establish a legal land claim in newly accessible frontier territory. Clear the forest, plant grass, stock cattle, and the land became productive, valuable, and defensible in a way that standing forest, however ecologically vital, simply was not under the incentives governments had created. What connects the Chicago stockyards to a cleared pasture in Central America or the Brazilian interior is not coincidence. It's the same underlying economic structure, refined and exported. Cattle require land. Land is cheapest where it is least developed. Development, in this system, has almost always meant clearing whatever stood there before, whether that was tallgrass prairie, Central American rainforest, or the Amazon itself. The railroads and refrigerated cars that built the American beef industry didn't just create a national market, they created a template, one that measured progress in cleared acreage and cattle heads. And that template proved remarkably easy to transplant anywhere in the world where forests still stood, and a market for cheap beef existed on the other end of a shipping route. By the final decades of the 20th century, the frontier that cattle had once claimed on horseback in Texas and Sonora had shifted decisively south, into the largest and most ecologically significant forest on Earth. What happened there, and what continues to happen there today, would turn a regional agricultural practice into one of the defining environmental questions of the modern era. By the final decades of the 20th century, the story of beef had become the story of the Amazon. What began as scattered colonial ranches and post-war land grant schemes had grown into the single largest driver of tropical deforestation on the planet. And understanding how that happened means understanding a chain of decisions that stretches from a Brazilian pasture all the way to a supermarket shelf on the other side of the world. Brazil's military government, which took power in 1964, treated the Amazon not as an ecosystem to be protected, but as an empty territory to be filled. Officials worried about foreign encroachment on the sparsely populated interior and saw cattle ranching as the fastest, cheapest way to establish a visible national presence across the basin. The government built roads deep into the forest, offered tax incentives to companies willing to convert rainforest into pasture, and issued land titles based on a simple, devastating logic. Land that had been cleared and put to productive use, meaning grazed by cattle, could be claimed as legally developed, while standing forest could not. This turned deforestation itself into a form of legal currency. A rancher didn't need to prove ownership through purchase or inheritance. He needed only to show that trees had been cut and grass had grown in their place. The scale of what followed is difficult to compress into a single number because the clearing never stopped at one moment or for one reason. It has continued in waves for over half a century, tracking commodity prices, government policy, road construction, and enforcement cycles that expand and contract with each new administration. But cattle ranching has remained the dominant force behind Amazon deforestation throughout nearly all of that period, responsible for a larger share of forest loss in the region than soy farming, logging, mining, and every other land use combined. Some of that pasture feeds cattle destined for Brazil's enormous domestic beef market, one of the largest in the world. Some of it feeds live cattle and leather bound for export. And a portion of the cleared land doesn't stay pasture forever. Ranchers often use cattle as the first wave of land conversion, clearing forest and grazing cattle for a few years to establish and legitimize a claim, before selling the now deforested, now legally recognized land to soybean operations that can extract even more value from it. Cattle, in this sense, became not just a product but a tool. The mechanism by which forest became farmland, became property, became profit. This pattern repeated with local variations across the broader region. In Bolivia and Paraguay, cattle ranching pushed into dry tropical forests and the Gran Chaco, one of the fastest disappearing forest ecosystems on the planet, largely unnoticed by a global public far more familiar with the Amazon's name. In Colombia, cattle expansion followed decades of civil conflict, as armed groups and displaced rural populations alike turned to ranching as one of the few reliable ways to establish control over contested land. None of these stories unfolded in isolation. All of them were shaped by the same basic economic reality that had defined cattle ranching since the Spanish first landed cows on Hispaniola. Land is valuable once it's claimed, and clearing it for cattle is one of the fastest ways to claim it. Global demand did the rest. As beef consumption climbed through the 20th century, driven by rising incomes, fast food expansion, and the post-war embrace of meat as a symbol of prosperity, international markets developed an appetite that domestic grasslands in wealthy countries alone could never fully satisfy. Brazil became the world's largest beef exporter, shipping product to markets across the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and beyond. Even in countries that don't import Brazilian beef directly, global commodity markets connect consumption everywhere to land pressure somewhere. A pasture cleared in the Amazon might feed cattle destined for a supermarket in Sao Paulo rather than a container ship bound for Rotterdam. But the underlying economic incentive, more cattle, more grazing land, more cleared forest, operates the same way regardless of where the final product ends up on a plate. Feed makes this web even more tangled. While much of Brazil's cattle graze directly on cleared pasture, the broader global beef and dairy system also depends heavily on soy and corn grown specifically for animal feed. And soy cultivation has its own deforestation footprint, particularly in the Cerrado, Brazil's vast tropical savanna that receives far less international attention than the Amazon, despite being cleared at an alarming rate. Beef, in other words, doesn't only cost forest through direct grazing. It costs forest indirectly, through the feed crops grown to fatten cattle in feedlots half a world away from where the trees once stood. The environmental consequences reach beyond the visible loss of trees. Cattle are ruminants, meaning their digestive systems rely on microbes that break down fibrous plant material, and that process produces methane as a byproduct. Methane doesn't linger in the atmosphere nearly as long as carbon dioxide, but while it's there, it traps heat far more powerfully, making cattle one of the more concentrated sources of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. Combine that with the carbon released when forest is burned or cleared to create new pasture, and beef production becomes one of the most land and climate-intensive ways to produce food that modern agriculture has ever developed. None of this means every rancher or every pasture operates identically. Some grazing systems, managed carefully, can support healthy soils and biodiversity far better than monoculture cropland. But the broad global pattern, cheap beef driving forest clearance, driving climate impact, has proven remarkably difficult to reverse once it takes hold in a region. Governments and international bodies have tried, with mixed results. In 2006, following intense public pressure from environmental organizations and a striking piece of investigative reporting connecting Amazon deforestation directly to cattle supply chains, major Brazilian meatpacking companies signed a set of commitments known as the Cattle Agreement, promising not to purchase cattle raised on illegally deforested land. Enforcement has been inconsistent, and cattle laundering, moving animals through intermediary ranches to obscure their true origin before they reach a slaughterhouse, has remained a persistent problem that undermines even well-intentioned supply chain commitments. Soy traders adopted a similar moratorium a year earlier, aimed at breaking the link between newly cleared Amazon land and soybean purchases. And while it slowed one particular driver of deforestation, it did little to stop cattle ranching from continuing to expand into the same forest through a different channel. Consumer-facing solutions have emerged alongside these policy efforts, though their impact remains a genuinely open question rather than a settled outcome. Plant-based burger companies have marketed themselves explicitly as forest-friendly alternatives to conventional beef, framing the choice at the grocery counter as one with global ecological consequences. Lab-grown or cultivated meat has advanced from laboratory curiosity toward early commercial approval in a handful of countries, promising, at least in theory, a version of beef that requires no pasture and no herd at all. Whether either technology can scale enough to meaningfully reduce global deforestation pressure remains uncertain, and in the meantime, global beef consumption, driven substantially by rising demand in rapidly growing economies, continues to climb rather than fall. What makes the history of beef different from most stories about a single food is how directly its past explains its present. The vaqueros who first worked Spanish mission herds, the fences that closed the American open range, the refrigerated rail cars that built the Chicago stockyards, the government land grants that turned Amazon rainforest into legally recognized pasture. None of these are separate stories. They're the same story, repeated across centuries and continents, because the underlying economic logic never really changed. Cattle turn open land into wealth, and wherever that logic finds forests still standing and a market willing to pay, the forest has tended to lose. So the next time beef appears on a plate, in a bun, or sizzling on a grill, it's worth remembering that its true cost was never really printed on the label. It's written instead across 5 centuries of cleared forest, displaced peoples, industrial labor, and a planet's atmosphere, compressed into something ordinary enough to eat without a second thought. If this changed how you think about beef, drop a comment with the detail that surprised you most, or the everyday food whose hidden history deserves the same kind of digging.